All right, let's dive into the book of Joshua. It's a text that most people think they have figured out. It's all about war and conquest, right? Well, what if that's only a tiny fraction of the real story?
So let me ask you something. When you hear the book of Joshua, what's the very first image that pops into your head?
Yeah, if you're like most of us, your mind probably jumps straight to warfare, to battles. And look, there's a reason it has that reputation.
I mean, you probably even know this song, right? That powerful image of the walls of Jericho just tumbling down. It's so iconic that it pretty much defines how we see the entire book.
But what if that impression, while not exactly wrong, is barely scratching the surface? Let's go beyond the Battle of Jericho and see what this book is actually about. Okay, now take a look at this. This is a breakdown of the book's content. The actual battle scenes, they make up less than a third of the whole book. A full 50%, half of the entire text, is about dividing up the land and Joshua's final speeches. That is a huge clue about where the real focus is.
And this really gets to the theological heart of the story. As the scholar Dr. David Howard puts it, this book isn't some celebration of military power. In fact, Israel never wins a battle because they have a stronger army. The story goes out of its way to show that God is the one actually behind the victory.
So here's the crucial takeaway. The battles are really just the means to an end. The true star of the show is the land of Canaan itself. And it's not presented as a conquest, but as an inheritance. It's the long-awaited fulfillment of a promise, a place of rest given as a gift.
So who was the leader at the very center of this incredible story? Well, to really get the book, we have to understand the man himself, Joshua.
First off, his Hebrew name Yehoshua literally means the Lord saves. And here's a wild connection. When you translate that name into Greek, it becomes Jesus, the exact same name as Jesus in the New Testament. So his very name points to divine deliverance, not human strength.
Now, Joshua didn't just show up out of nowhere. The man had a long career building up to this. He started as Moses' right-hand man, his personal aide. He was one of only 2 spies who came back from Canaan with a good report, and he was publicly named as the next leader. He literally grew into this massive role over decades.
And you can see his entire journey in just the change in his title. At the start of the book, he's just Moses' assistant. It's Moses who gets called the servant of the Lord. But at the very end of the book, only after Joshua has died, is he finally given that same ultimate title. He had to finish the mission to earn that honor.
But wait a minute. If Joshua died, he couldn't have written about his own death, right? So, who wrote the book? This leads us into a really interesting historical puzzle.
The short answer is, we don't really know. The book is anonymous. Now, Joshua almost certainly wrote parts of it. The text even says he recorded one ceremony, but you see these little phrases sprinkled throughout, like, and it's there until this day, which strongly suggest a final editor was putting it all together sometime after the events actually happened.
And that brings us to an even bigger historical mystery, one that scholars have been debating for well over a century: the timing of this whole story.
See, the date of Joshua's conquest is tied directly to another huge event, the Exodus from Egypt. They happened about a generation apart. And when you try to pin a date on the Exodus, well, there is no simple answer. Believe it or not, one whole side of this debate comes down to a single number, 480. The book of 1 Kings says that King Solomon started building his famous temple exactly 480 years after the Exodus. So this gives us 2 competing theories. The early date theory takes that 480-year number literally. We know Solomon's temple build started around 966 BC, so you count back 480 years and you land at 1446 BC for the Exodus. Simple enough. But the late day theory leans more on archaeology. Archaeologists have found these layers of widespread destruction in Canaanite cities that date to right around 1200 BC. On top of that, an Egyptian monument from 1208 BC called the Merneptah stele gives us the very first mention of Israel in the land outside of the Bible.
Both sides have really compelling arguments. And you know, the debate itself really just highlights how challenging it is to perfectly line up ancient texts with what we find in the ground with modern archaeology. It's a fascinating puzzle with no easy solution.
So let's zoom out. With all this complexity and debate, what's the big takeaway? Why does this ancient story still matter to us today?
Well, first and foremost, we can see that it is so much more than a simple war story. Calling it that would be like calling the novel Moby Dick a book about fishing. I mean, sure, but you'd be missing the entire point.
Instead, what we have is this rich, multi-layered story. It's about a nation learning to follow a new leader after the legend Moses. It's the culmination of a divine promise made generations earlier. It's a story about how a people form their entire national identity. And, of course, it's a history that continues to fuel scholarly debate to this very day.
So I'll leave you with this question. Knowing now that the book's real focus is on promise and inheritance, not just military conquest, and knowing about all the complex historical debates swirling around it, how does that change the way we read this ancient, powerful, and influential story today?